All right. Thank you, everyone who's joining us. We're going to wait just a minute and let people enter into the webinar space. So as people are coming in from the lobby, please feel free to put your name and where you're coming from into the chat. It'd be good to know who's joining us today. But welcome, and we will get started in just a few minutes as people sort of are able to enter into the webinar. Thank you. So again, we're just going to wait just another minute or so to let people join for those coming in, just to make sure that everyone has a chance to enter. And if you would like to put your name and your affiliation, where you're coming from, into the chat, that would be great. Great. And we will get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're really excited about this event, and we're really happy that you were able to be part of it and to participate in the discussion. My name is Laurel Bradley. I'm a Gender and Social Inclusion Advisor at Pact. On behalf of Pact and IREX, we're excited to host this expert panel on how technology-facilitated gender-based violence, or TFGBV, impacts democracies. After the many events that took place over the month of March that included a focus on gender equality and technology, from sessions at the Commission on the Status of Women to the Summit for Democracy, we saw a real opportunity to keep the drumbeat going on this important issue, focusing specifically today on how TFGBV not only has detrimental effects for survivors, their families, and communities, but also for the health of democratic systems worldwide. However, before we dive into the conversation, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. If you would like to add questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function. We would like everyone to stay muted and their cameras off, except the panelists. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the session, so please do put your questions in. We'd love to hear from you. And we would like to acknowledge that TFGBV is inherently a topic that is about violence. And we know that this is not an easy topic for many people, and that it strikes particularly close to home for many. So we do encourage people to participate in the webinar today as fits their needs and interests, and also to practice self-care as is appropriate for you. Now I would like to briefly turn over the welcome to Milica Panic, the Chief of Party for the CSM Stand Leader with Associate Award, to give a brief contextual overview of the CSM Stand activity, which is one of the hosts of the webinar today. Milica?
Thank you, Laurel. So together with the Transform project, CSM Stand is pleased to host you to the webinar today with our expert panelists discussing this important topic of how TFGBV undermines the values that are the foundation of healthy democracies. So CSM Stand, or the civil society and media strengthened together and advancing in the new direction activity. It's a leader with Associates Award funded by the USAID, and it's led and by Pact and co-led with IREX with a consortium of the 19 partners. CSM Stand is comprised of the two regional leaders with Associates Award. One is covering Asia, Europe, Eurasia, and LAC, and then the other one is covering the Middle East and the North Africa and Africa region. Led by our consortium partners, the CSM Stand Associates Awards are focused on the different activities, such as strengthening subnational civil society and media, led by women and youth, for instance, in Nepal, improving access to credible, accurate, and reliable information for South Sudan citizens through independent radio operations, and then building individuals' resilience to the TFGBV while strengthening institution capacity and commitment to decreasing its prevalence. CSM Stand is very proud that we have a learning agenda, and we have 3 focus areas there. The first one is the safety and well-being. The second, network and collective actions, and the last one, information integrity and public trust. There are also 4 cross-cutting priorities, which are activities that are led by women and youth, have a focus on norms and behavior change, are intentional about sustainability, and take into account opportunities and constraints in the civic space. The Transform initiative is one of the CSM Associates Award, and in particular will contribute to learning about safety and well-being and contribute to CSM Stand understanding of networks and collective actions. Through Transform, we also hope to learn about effective means for changing norms in technology-driven public forums. CSM Stand is pleased to have you here with us today to engage with a panel of experts who will highlight critical and often overlooked aspects of how TFGBV impacts all of us and undermines democratic systems. I would like to turn it over to my colleague from IREX, Katja Vogt, the Chief of Party for Transform, to provide you a brief overview of Transform project. Thank you.
Thank you, Milica. Thank you, Laurel. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's such an important topic, and I will try to be very, very brief so we can get to the exciting part of this conversation. But just to tell you a little bit more about the Transform, as Milica mentioned, it's a CSM Stand Associate Award, and IREX serves as the lead consortium partner. But we work with partners on this, with Makaya, with Slunky Gender Justice, Pact, and Moonshot. The program has just kicked off. It was officially announced by USAID at the Summit for Democracy. So we will be working to address technology-facilitated gender-based violence. You will hear me and others say TFGBV for short throughout this conversation today, especially as it's directed at women in politics and public life in 3 pilot countries, Kenya, Georgia, and Guatemala. Transform, to me and to many others and to my colleagues and partners, signals a critical commitment and recognition that if half the population faces digital platforms as containing threats, abuse, and harms, where they are silenced and pushed out from public discourse, these digital spaces cannot claim or aspire to be democratic and conducive to freedom of speech or expression. To expand our understanding and ability to address this challenge, Transform will collaborate with and provide support to local partners, organizations that will include representatives of human rights and civil society, community-based women empowerment and leadership organization, civic tech and digital democracy organizations, and organizations providing critical support and services to survivors of violence, violence against women and girls, GBV and TFGBV, and many others as well, with roles to play in adapting, designing, and applying tools and strategies for better prevention and mitigation of TFGBV. We anticipate that the efforts of our Kenyan, Georgian, and Guatemalan partners will include coalition building and advocacy, productive partnership with system stakeholders who can have positive impact on the enabling environment, legislature, enforcement, and tech infrastructure, and campaigns to challenge misogyny and behaviors that normalize abuse and attacks of women in online and digital spaces. We also anticipate local innovations and leadership that does not fall into any of these categories, and we are looking forward to supporting our partners in carrying out new and impactful solutions. We will learn, gather evidence, and share these insights with others across regional and global networks. And with that, I will stop talking about Transform and turn it over to the moderator of our panel, my colleague, Lena Safran, the regional physical security expert of the IREX's Securing Access to Free Expression project, SAFE for short. Luna is an experienced journalist who produces news stories, multimedia storytelling materials, and feature stories. And in her role as a journalist, she has faced many of the challenges that we will discuss today and has covered the topic of gender-based violence in her reporting. Over to you, Luna.
Thank you so much, Katya. Welcome, everyone. We are very happy to host you in today's webinar, and we will try to keep it as interactive as possible. Let me start by briefly introducing what we will be doing today. Technology-facilitated gender-based violence is a term that encompasses online harassment, stalking, bullying, doxing, threats of violence, including acts of sexual violence, and so forth. Frequently, online violence can also cross into real-life violence. Women, girls, and gender-diverse individuals, particularly from groups who experience multiple forms of discrimination, are most frequently targeted. Perpetrators draw on restrictive gender and social norms, including beliefs about who is authorized to participate in public dialogue and political activities and discussions, in efforts to delegitimizing and to silencing women and marginalized groups. Now, this limits the voices in democratic processes and decision-making, as well as it reduces the representation of issues affecting the diversity of people within any country. So in this panel, we're going to be focusing on repercussions of TFGBV, or technology-facilitated gender-based violence. When is it actually used strategically to attack pluralism in democratic systems, not only for women, girls, and gender-diverse individuals, but also for democracy itself? Our panelists today will provide a discussion that highlights the importance of addressing the topic of TFGBV and how to stop this form of violence for those people targeted, but also to protect the health of democracies worldwide. So we hope that this will be a very fruitful discussion, and we're looking forward to also hearing from the audience their questions. And now I'm going to introduce our inspiring panelists. I'm going to start by introducing Irene Mwandwa, who joins us from the Ugandan organization Policy. She is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Feminism Movement Building. Paulina Ibera is a communications and advocacy expert. She joins us from Fundación Multitudes, where she leads the Women's Observatory Against Disinformation. And lastly, Christina Wilfor, who is the co-founder of #ShePersisted and the Global Democracy Advisor at Reset Tech. We're very happy to have our very inspiring panelists with us, and I'm going to start by discussing how we are going to tackle this topic in our panel. So as stated, TFGBV is not only has harmful effects for individuals who are targeted with harassment, abuse, and violence in attempts to control their public activities, but it also produces negative outcome for democracies in any country. In a recent report by ShePersisted titled Monetizing Misogyny, Gender Disinformation, and the Undermining of Women's Rights and Democracy Globally, there's a statement. And the statement says, a well-funded transitional movement has been at work during the last 20 years to backslide women's rights and undermine democracy globally. Now, the report continues by stating that gender disinformation campaigns are used by political movements and at times by government themselves to undermine women and women's political participation and to weaken democratic institutions and human rights. To start out the discussion, I'd like to ask Christina if she can share some insights into the findings from this report, and in particular, if you can speak on how TFGBV directed at women and marginalized groups in political and public life isn't just individualized harassment, but strategically target efforts to force women and marginalized groups from these spaces. So all for you, Christina.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, always talking about a very difficult topic, but at least in community together. So let me begin by saying that, my roots are really in democracy development. That's what I've spent all of my life doing in different forms. And I think in the democracy development field, we've gotten this topic a bit wrong. And so now is an opportunity to reframe this in order to really put forward a winning agenda in response. So I'm really glad to be in discussion with all of you today about what that looks like, what it requires of us. And a well-defined problem is in fact half of the solution. So we've been using different terms to try to capture what's going on, whether that's gendered disinformation, technology facilitated online violence, gender-based violence online. And so let me say a little bit about why these definitions matter and what really we're seeing in terms of the overall field. When we started to coin this as gendered disinformation, that was very intentional in order to focus on not the idea that technology is neutral, that it itself is creating the environment in which is dangerous for women, but to back up and look at the elements of disinformation and apply them to what's going on with abuse and manipulation of gender. So when we kind of distill disinformation as a concept, it means, coordinated, inauthentic sharing, inauthentic behavior, gaming the algorithms. Those are the elements that are part of the attack machine that has been organized by in many cases, very powerful forces. I choose not to call them strongmen anymore when we refer to some of the autocratic leaders behind this movement, but let's say nationalistic chauvinists may be the way, because it's a combination of trying to other women. And in many cases, the attacks on women leaders are organized to call them unpatriotic. The attacks are intersectional. They are force multiplying different factors of their identity. And the deception behind it, which is the other hallmark of disinformation, is meaning to point to the character attacks that are not necessarily provable or disprovable, but are deception. So those are really the hallmarks of disinformation, and why 5 years ago, Lucina D'Meca began to document this in the first report, where it wasn't intended to be a critical analysis of social media, but from the interviews with 88 women across 30 countries, it was clear that social media is no longer a mirror held up to society reflecting its existing biases or misogyny, but in fact, social media is an attack machine. It is the weaponization of misogyny that allows this to really affect two things that are going on globally. One is the distortion of gender identity, gender as a concept. The second is to attack the women who are on the forefront of the progressive agendas to defend democracy or to defend gender equality. So the Monetizing Misogyny report is 5 years later. How is this system beginning to worsen? And so the trends are very clear. When we see gender disinformation paired with online abuse and violence, it is a pervasive problem faced by women across political contexts, across culture, and is getting worse. And this is the other point of She Persisted's work, is to really bring in the role of technology into the conversation and the choices of tech executives, because we can't talk about how the system works without reflecting on how it is benefiting and enabled by the tools of big tech. And those are choices. Maria Ressa talks so eloquently about both the problems and solutions, and she refers to the algorithms as simply opinions in code, like a news producer, like a editorial director. They're deciding what stories get attention, what stories get on the front page, what stories get at the bottom of the website, in the digital world. Those are the same choices around algorithms that have been organized to respond to engagement and engagement metrics that are based on hate, vitriol, and very, very dangerous for women. So gender disinformation in our now 5 years of deeply mapping this from different countries and contexts, we believe it should be treated as an early warning system for the backsliding on democracy. And when, to your question on the issue of intersectionality, we see some very disturbing trends in this regard. I was just in Kenya a few weeks ago, and a very, symbolic story came out of the recent election there, where you have many women who are competing for office, you have young women who are getting involved, and you have a young Muslim woman from Mombasa who has a disability, and she had a faked image-based abuse, so a faked porn online with her face, fetishizing her disability. So that is very, very dangerous and not unusual, right? So interesting enough, we talk a lot in the broader disinformation field as being worried about deep fakes and how they're abused, but we don't recognize that 90% of deep fakes are currently based on women and image-based abuse. And even when you prove those to be false and you try to get them offline in the different, multiple platforms that they show up, you cannot detach the sentiment left by that, which is to communicate that women do not belong in politics, in public spaces. And even when those are proved false, they continue to do damage and undermine them. And that happens at a local level, as the case I just mentioned in Kenya, and at a high level with Anna Barbeck, who was the candidate for chancellor in the German election, now the Minister of Foreign Affairs. She met the first week of her campaign with a deep fake of her as a porn star. And so, of course, this was proven to be false. And the websites now, 2 years later, continue to thrive, picturing her in sexually explicit positions and photos of her. And again, that is the backdrop of much of this, which is to create the sense that women are not equal participants in public life. They don't belong in these public spaces. And I can say from the interviews we've been doing, years now, that this is taking a toll and that women are choosing to step back and not engage. For the mapping that we did with the monetizing misogyny report, which I'm looking for a particular statistic here, what we found is that across border, across political system, whether we're talking about the US, Tunisia, India, Brazil, Germany, Italy, the patterns are the same. And the patterns are that this is a system that is benefiting from the lax oversight of the social media companies, and one that is inherently tied in with dangerous, undemocratic, far-right movements. And when we look at issues of ethnic minorities and how they are targeted, religious minorities and how they are targeted, it's just one more factor to create an environment in which they are undermined, which women are accused of being unnationalistic, unpatriotic, and other ways in which they're undermining their agendas. Let me just end on a couple additional examples that give you a flavor for some of what's come out in the recent research. In Hungary, there was an MP who was faced with a doctored photo of her when she was, in fact, in the hospital for COVID. So accused her of lying about being hospitalized, and then had doctored photos of her wearing a headscarf, promising Arabic lessons for children, which was totally erroneous. In Tunisia, another member of parliament who's the head of the Individual Freedom and Equality Commission, she was accused of being corrupt, anti-Islam, again, that unpatriotic, being influenced by foreign powers and a tool of Western influence. In Brazil, you have a politician, a former member of parliament. She had a t-shirt on that said rebel. That it was, an activist t-shirt. There was a photoshopped image of her with that shirt saying Jesus is transgender over a rainbow. totally erroneous, totally false. And Brazil is, one of the classic cases in gender disinformation, with the targeting and death and murder of Marielle Franco, and the way that that was meant to carry the attacks forward. So 5 years ago was that political assassination. In the 2022 election in Brazil, Black Brazilians running for office were accused of being the Marielle Franco candidate. So the disinformation campaigns do not even end with the women who are not only caught in the crosshairs, but in fact, in this case, ended up murdered. But they are meant to carry on the sentiment and the positioning around this. Lastly, in Italy, a former senator and minister of education, she's been behind curriculum to address gender-based equality in education. She's been a long time advocate of gender responsive education, and she became the target of abuse and dehumanizing comments, calling her dangerous, a monster, ugly, a liar, incompetent, because she's also secretly trying to push a transgender agenda. So these are what women face every day. We talk a lot in our field about resilience, but I think it is actually cruel to ask women to be more resilient to this kind of system that is targeting them, while not asking tech executives to do better and not demanding that we have safety over products, which is really the threat surface in the way that these campaigns are able to grow, thrive, and continue to metastasize.
Thank you so much, Christina, for opening the door to this conversation. I can see Irene and Paulina both shaking their heads, and it only reflects on how global this is, especially when you mention terms such as being agents of the West, but also delegitimizing efforts of women, but also spreading rumors and spreading fake news and spreading Photoshopped images. And so this leads me to my second question, in which it will focus more maybe on political candidates, and also the push that political candidates sometimes get due to these attacks. So policy provides a really interesting data point that in 2020, only 24% of members of the parliament in sub-Saharan Africa were women. Presumably, there are several factors that affect women's decision to run as political candidates, and as their success in elections and selection for being appointed into certain political roles. Yet, almost certainly, for many women, one of those factors is the risk of being attacked online or of having to deal with different forms of TFGBV. Irene, could you tell us more about some of the trends that policy sees regarding how TFGBV affects decisions that women candidates and politicians make about using social media or other digital strategies in their campaigns or to promote their political work online?
Thank you very much to you, Christina, for starting off with this conversation with some of the examples of how women continue to be harassed online, especially using synthetic media. Synthetic media, of course, to date, highly is used to discredit women in public life, women journalists, women politicians, young women who to date, we know that women from the ages of 14 to 24 continue to grapple with this issue and have no recourse, especially in most parts of Africa. But to get specific into the context of today, which is women in politics, at Policy, we were able to conduct a study against the 2021 Ugandan election. And we asked ourselves about 5 research questions when we were just looking at some of the issues that come on online violence against women. We found obviously that online violence against women in politics is anchored in gender and sexual morality norms, especially in the context of African women in politics. And almost all African women in politics have experienced a form of online violence, such as offensive name calling, sexual harassment, stalking, threats of violence, rape, death, amongst others. When we got into the research, as I was saying, we asked ourselves 5 questions. How do women politicians in Uganda use social media platforms for campaigning during the general election? And how does the use of social media platforms differ among men and women candidates? We also wanted to find out from the 2021 general election in Uganda, what evidence of online violence against women politicians exists on social media platforms and how it manifests, and what is the association of online violence against women politicians and factors such as gender, age, political party affiliation, frequency of social media use, and electoral results. And to bring in a very key aspect of why we went into this study and other future studies we are conducting against women politicians in Africa is that in the wake of COVID-19 in March of 2020, this was at the realm of the COVID-19 pandemic and also at the height of Ugandan political campaigning period, as the election was going to be held in January of 2021. And once the WHO, World Health Organization, announced that we need to stay home and save lives, many countries also that had elections had to close off physical campaigning as from the advice of the World Health Organization, and also due to the multitudes of people that they were inviting in political rallies, political campaigning session, and door-to-door campaigns, really. What happened in the context of Uganda is that the national government issued directives on political campaigning, of course, putting very many new entrants into politics at a disadvantage, other minority groups such as women, young women, people with disability who are vying into a disadvantage. Many of them, of course, had to quickly round up their energies and round up their resources and think, what are we going to do in the wake of COVID-19 against winning in the 2021 January election? And many of them, as you all know, in the wake of the pandemic, all of us resorted to using digital platforms for our everyday task, and for politicians for their political campaigning. For many who are already using it, now they had to, increase the momentum and increase resources into really communicating with their constituents against the election. What happened in Uganda in this period of about April to January of 2021, April 2020 to January of 2021 is something that has also been seen in several countries in the world. It was alleged that several platforms were restricted in this time, both WhatsApp and Facebook. And to date, one of the platforms is restricted, and many have to opt usage, and many have to use it using VPNs, which are expensive solutions. And to date, we've also found that many women, after we sampled about 300 accounts of both men and women, we found that, first of all, let me just give you a quick snapshot. I don't want to go into the breakdown because it's very detailed, and I would like to invite all of us to read some of the links that Laurel is sharing as we're speaking. As of December of 2020, while the election was coming up in January 2021, the usage of social media platforms, and specifically for Twitter, was 14 tweets by women against 31 tweets by men. As of the election month itself, that's January of 2021, 11 women candidates, there were 11 tweets for 20, as of January of 2021, there were 11 tweets against 20 tweets by men candidates. What does this show? This showed that, there was a preference in the usage of digital platforms. We saw there was a preference by men candidates to prefer Twitter at 83%, and for 16.4% of women using Twitter from the 300 samples that we took. And of the 300, 72% of women preferred to use Facebook, and 27.4% of men preferred to use Facebook, against the restriction that also followed thereafter, and the need to continue using Facebook using a VPN. The other key findings we got from this study against the 2021 general election in Uganda is that men and women experience online violence differently. This is very important to note because it's not just women politicians who receive violence. Even men experience online violence and other forms of violence in real life, offline. However, they experience this differently. Women are more likely, we all know, to receive violence in forms of trolling, as has been shared by Christina, sexual violence through deepfakes. This is through synthetic media using AI to alter images, and body shaming. And men, in our study, we found that are more likely to experience hate speech and satirical comments, which really don't pertain their body. They don't pertain their sexual preferences, amongst others. 18% of the accounts belonging to women leaders who we sampled experienced sexual violence compared to just 8% of men. You can see there's a very huge difference with the numbers of women being on the end and men receiving sexual violence. Then we also found that both men and women use online tools for engagement, for sure. There was a greater online activity linked with higher levels of online violence for women as opposed to men, even when they shared very general information about their candidacy and their political campaign. Then the common categories, as I had shared earlier, of violence that were experienced included trolling, insults, body shaming, sexualized and gendered abuse. You may ask yourself, how did we come up with these findings? Of course, we used, at the moment, which is not common, we were able to use API, application programming interface. And we're also able to use websites such as hate.org. We were also able to use our own Twitter and Facebook accounts to just look at the names of the common women and men candidates. We're also able to use, through our data scientist resources, through Python, and also some Facebook packages in that sense. The other sources of data that we managed to collect, the data sources mainly included Twitter hashtags, tweets and replies, Facebook comments, and posts themselves. The total number of sampling, as I had shared, was between 200 to 300, because the number was with a slight difference, because if this was such a bad experience, but many women candidates, once they received online violence, stopped posting altogether. So you will find that there was some activity online on maybe Christina, who was a candidate in Uganda from April to say September. And we had to get another candidate to sample because her sample size may not have been, her sample was not possibly the best because they stopped tweeting very early on in the election phase. The other...
I want to build on this, Irene, and to continue with you. But since you mentioned a very important point regarding women stopping to actually post online, I want to also ask you, but I want to jump to Paulina and then go back to you to ask you more about this. Paulina, if you're hearing us, do you think that the way technology facilitated gender-based violence is unfolding, as Irene was saying, do you think it will impact how views of democratic participation or spaces are formed for younger generations or for their immediate or future participation? Do you think that this will discourage women to participate while fearing the TFGBV repercussions? We're hearing about candidates who are not posting anymore. We're hearing about candidates who are being sidelined. What about the young generation of women who are watching how this is unfolding in different regions? Do you think that we're going to come to a point where there will be no participation, or there will be a significantly less participation, sadly?
Thank you, Luna. Thank you, Irene and Christina. They both made extremely important remarks. And I think that they're both, the research that She Persists in Policy are doing is all, very much helpful, especially for the research in terms of what's happening with youth. And as you mentioned, we're leading the Women's Observatory Against Disinformation. We work not only with women, but girls, LGBTQ plus community, youth, and of course, people from indigenous populations and other vulnerable communities. And we're working in 7 countries in Latin America currently. And I'm sure that some of you and some of the participants and attendees have seen some of our research, particularly in Chile, where we started with a pilot of the Women's Observatory. We surveyed parliamentarians, and we surveyed also women from the conventional constitutional process, which ended last year with a very significant failure for the country. But that helps a little bit to understand what you're asking, which is the dynamic of what's happening and what's going to happen with this type of threat, not only to women and girls, but also to democracy as a whole. And the research, when we surveyed the parliamentarians women, 94% of them, of the women parliamentarians in Chile, responded that they had been victims of disinformation as a form of gender political violence. And 60% of the members of the Conventional Constitution, women, had also been become victims, unfortunately. Then when we look into a secondary report that we carry out also during 2021, specifically with young women activists, we found out that 56% of them stated that they might withdraw from activism and for a political career just to avoid the impact of gender disinformation in their lives and the ones surrounding them. So there is a real risk for female leadership and equal representation. And as I think that there is no more discussion about the fact that this information as a form of technology facilitated gender violence is real, and it can discourage. But furthermore, delegitimize the participation of women in politics. And that, I will say, is the more core issue of this. And is being used as a weapon to exclude women and gender diverse people, women representing vulnerable groups, for participating in democracy. And the intention is very clear. We've seen research, again, by She Persisted, particularly, that the intention is to humiliate women and girls and exposing them to public scrutiny to force them out of public life, basically trying to portray them as unfit for public life. And this risk actually increases the vulnerability of women to become victims of this form of threat and discourage them from pursuing a political or civil leadership position. So the main issues that women face are whether or not they are a member of the government opposition, being young, and especially under 40 years of age, and number 3, belonging to a minority or an historical vulnerable group. In our research, we found out that young women from indigenous populations are 5 times more likely to be impacted by disinformation as a form of, with the objective of actually discouraging them from participating of public life. In Latin America, where we basically work, only 23% of the elected seats are occupied by women at the national level. And at the local level, it's only 10%. And as we can see how young women are one of the main populations actually facing technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and as a barrier to participate in public life, this becomes a very important obstacle for the immediate and future participation in democracy. If we want to increase women's participation in democracy, we must start by addressing the main concerns of the young generations, especially young women, by implementing strategies to ensure their engagement in democracy and amplifying their voices in public space. It's not an option now it's very difficult because as my fellow panelists mentioned, we're asking them to be more resilient. We're asking young generations to to increase the resilience to combat disinformation. And at the same time, the only tool that they find at their disposal to protect themselves is actually shut down their social media presence, which is the main tool for them to get to know the public and for the constituencies to get to know them. And we're not setting up specific frameworks to prevent and to protect that participation, and that includes actually not making social media platforms accountable for what's happening.
Paulina, let me ask you a maybe difficult and wide question, but also to open the floor to Christina and Irene to pitch in on this. Do you think that the effect of foreign influence on democracies around the world through what you mentioned, misinformation and disinformation campaigns, do you think that this is inducing this kind of hesitancy or this kind of pushback for, because these campaigns are big. We're talking about online campaigns against women. We're talking about big campaigns. We're not talking about few bots that are attacking some women, that are calling one woman by her looks. So could you describe the kind of outcomes that these type of campaigns that are supported sometimes by foreign governments have when they target women candidates, politicians, democratic movement? I also want to invite Christina and Irene to pitch in on this, because I know it's a cross-cultural, global question when we're talking about these campaigns.
Yeah, and that's, it's something that we're seeing across the board. We're starting to do work in other countries in Latin America, and I started looking particularly at the type of content that is being used to target women, young activists. Girls are trying to enter into public life, and it's in instances where this information is influenced by external agents. It has been observed, we're seeing that such occurrences are more prevalent in contexts of conflict and the exercise of soft power. So however this information is a tool for hegemony could have a broader purpose, especially when considered in conjunction with the analysis of interests of external agents in order to identify potential correlations. So that's what we're trying to do. So for example, speaking of China's influence in Latin America, the Asian power is one of the most significant destinations for exports, imports, and increasing as a sort of foreign investment, in particularly in its infrastructure and mining. China's interest in Latin America comes from an economic perspective. That's the influence that they wanted to exercise. So they are resorting to instruments of influence in areas other than the economic sphere to promote and protect its strategic interest. For example, by intervening in public policy voting processes, or even in mega regulatory procedures, as is in the case, well, at least as we have seen in our research in the previous constitutional process in Chile, and thus potentially looking at increasing ways to influence politics and economic decision-making processes in the regions. Following these guidelines, we aim to firmly protect democracy's process and values and the correct use of citizens' rights to information, and especially protecting the participation of women and other vulnerable groups. We will soon start a research project to investigate, inform, monitor, and denounce the dissemination of disinformation and its impact on democratic processes, especially that information that propagates the violation of violence against women who participate in the public world. So, but here it's very important when we talk about foreign influence and how it really first and foremost impact women's rights, which are, again, in Latin America particularly, the majority of women the majority of environmental and human rights defenders are actually women. So when we started conducting this research, we started to look between the influence the influence between China and the country, in this particular Chile, and the disinformation that circulated around the first constitutional process and its repercussions in the rest of the region. And initial observations see a correlation between disinformation campaigns on land rights, on water lines, and autonomy of public indigenous populations, economic interests related to extractive industry, for example, copper and lithium, and of course on the reproductive rights of women. So it's all very, very clear. It's a matter of looking into and making the exercise of correlating the economic interests of foreign countries into a particular situation and understanding that there is a real connection between women's rights and democracy.
Thank you, Paulina. Christina?
Yeah, I was just going to say that we should look at the larger context of what's going on globally. And I would refer to Freedom House's State of Freedom report. So we're on the 17th year of decline in the state of freedom when you look at the global trends. And so when we look at the nature of when women are attacked, as Paulina said, those who are speaking out on women's rights, of course, that's a natural. But it's also women who are taking leadership positions on fair migration and immigration policies, as well as climate change. And that sort of really shows us that some of the far right movements, they differ from region to region, but are a lot of what's fueling this kind of attack system. And it is the women who are either as activists, often on the front lines of those pro-democracy defenses, or as politicians are leading on those issues. So I think that's the context in which democracy, is being challenged across the globe. And it's almost a convenient just tactic in which to focus on gender and the women who are on the forefront playing on that implicit bias and misogyny. Two more points of data. It is interesting. It did not get a lot of attention, and we should all go back into this report and really deeply absorb what this means. In the 2018 March for Women's Lives, and this was the most successful, most well-attended march in US history, which says a lot. That was an effort that across the ocean in Russia, we see that they had a women's march desk in which they attacked the Muslim head of the women's march, made that a localized controversy and issue, and essentially eroded the leadership structure of that entity. That was being organized in a very explicit way, from Russia. The evidence is there. I'll put it in the chat by a very well-established, credible researcher. You also have, back to the Anna Barbeck example I mentioned, where that first deep fake was issued, and overall, it was 5 times the amount of amplification of the attacks against Barbeck that were coming from Russian sources. So, this is not to say we all need to message around Russia's nefarious involvement or China's in these places. We need to understand it and deeply absorb how it's getting weaponized and how those foreign influence operations are not being caught by major platforms, which is a problem. But we also need to deal with the issues of local controversy that they're able to tap into. And so that's part of the response side in the counter disinformation work, is how do you strengthen our ability to resist the attempt to create a distrust, attacks on institutions, internal attacks on movements, because that will give us a better position to be less affected by some of these efforts where they're just jumping into the conversation to make things worse.
Thank you, Christina. Irene, and I would also like to just throw in the question, since we are talking about foreign influence and we're discussing how this is affecting women when it comes to misinformation, disinformation campaigns. In your opinions, how does this foreign influence affect what issues are represented in democratic structures? Does it affect, or maybe it doesn't? I'm throwing in this question because it's interesting to look also at this point. Irene, please go ahead.
Thank you, Luna. I'll just spend a few minutes just to finalize on our study, just a minute to just also just peg on the rationale for our study again, was that the survival of democracy in this digital era is closely tied to internet freedom and an open internet. And Uganda's 2021 January elections was a very close example to that, because in the wake of the pandemic, where we were told no physical contact or no physical engagements, especially with multitudes of people, then we highly relied on the internet. Therefore, it's really important that researchers are able to, bring this evidence, and also really for governments to allow for the open use of, for the use of the open internet. So following the findings of the amplified abuse report that I have just shared, we found that very many women are capable and actively use digital tools while campaigning and to interact with the electorate. Beyond that, what we have done at Policy is that we ask ourselves, do they reflect this personal decision in parliaments, in councils, in cabinets, in the executive, in the judiciary? And we've been able to, we launched a program called Vote Women, where we are trying to ask women leaders who are either incumbent or those who did not win an election, or those who are actually sitting in office, are you able to take this personal choice to make better decisions in terms of digital rights or data protection or other data governance issues that are arising in your country? And in terms of the external influence, Luna, I'll be very, very open and say some of the data governance mechanisms, frameworks, and bills and actually enacted laws in some of our countries in Africa are literally copy-paste of some of the global north countries. So you can see there's a lot of work to be done, and there's very high influence of, other countries and other actors. If we do not contextualize to local issues and to some of the gendered needs that some women, I won't speak for all women, but most women need in Africa, then we will be really missing the point about some of the data governance issues, and we'll be implementing digital and data governance mechanisms that are really out of context and do not serve the people of Africa. So there is very high influence of external actors, whether directly, formally or indirectly and informally, because we find ourselves with very poor engagement in these processes. Women leaders themselves who are elected in parliaments, in councils, are unable to articulate or engage in public debate on data and digital governance. So Policy has made it up, we have incentivized women politicians who we work with directly, about 100 of them spread across Africa, to, when issues of data and digital governance arise in councils, in parliament, you should be able to ask a set of questions about some of these issues. In Tanzania, we've seen there's the data protection bill that's coming out. So we've been trying to engage the council, women council leaders, councillors, to be able to engage in the process and not keep quiet when these debates are happening in councils and in parliament, because the risk with this is that it will lack, as I had shared, a contextual, a context, and it will also lack direct experiences of African women and girls. So you're very right, Luna, there's high influence. Unfortunately, it speaks to the, the training that is really needed at the high level, by the training needed by stakeholders at the high level positions, from the African Union to the local government level in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. I want to point out also very important points and an important link that Christina was kind enough to mention in the chat box. So please feel free to also follow up on what's happening in the chat box and drop us your questions. We have some space to take some questions at the end, so please don't hesitate. And I'd like to try and answer one of the questions that were raised in the chat box. Was there any digital security training for women activists in your country, and did it have any impact? As someone who works in a global safety and security program for journalists, and I can say that so many trainings are given around the world for women when it comes to safety and security, and specifically digital security. However, sadly, and from point of view of experience, when we're being attacked online, it's not enough to have the basic digital safety and security tools, because these campaigns, these digital campaigns that aim to slander and to harass and to delegitimize women online cannot be faced by few tools that are related to digital safety and to how to better protect your accounts. You are facing an army basically of accounts and of bots that are trying to politically or socially discredit you in your work. So sadly, all of these trainings are important, but sadly not enough. This is why we always talk about the importance of solidarity and of networking when it comes to this global dilemma. And this is why such panels actually are important, and such discussions are important to have out loud, because it is a global issue. So I just wanted to point out the answer to this question from a safety perspective. I'm going to go back to you, Paulina. Governments are tasked with protecting the rights and security of their citizens, but with TFGBV, it is evident that the regulatory environment is insufficient, and that women and people from marginalized groups often do not have effective avenues for recourse nor access to justice when they are targeted. So Paulina, if you can just walk us through some of the shortcomings of existing legal framework that creates impunity for TFGBV. Where are legal frameworks magnifying the harm done by this form of attacks to individuals as well as to democratic systems? And I would also like to hear Christina's take on this. So go ahead, Paulina.
Yeah, thank you, Luna. And I just wanted to be clear that this is a multi-layer problem. This is a global problem. I remember actually Christina mentioned it and put it so well in a closed door meeting a few weeks ago, where she said, this is such a huge, this is an issue as big as climate change. And we cannot find an easy solution. And on top of that, we have two additional big problems, which is the use of algorithms that lack ethics and artificial intelligence, of course, and the lack of participation of social media platforms into finding a solution to this. So the way that we're seeing this, at least from Multitudes's perspective, and after doing some research on the legal frameworks in some countries in Latin America, we believe that co-regulation is a mechanism to build, is the only way at this point to build a strong regulatory framework that can transcend the digital space. And I'm sure some of you know, but this is a mechanism where governments, civil society organizations, academia, and hopefully big tech companies promote and strengthen collaboration between themselves to establish measures aimed at protecting and promoting information integrity and considering, hopefully, the perspective of all actors involved with a preventive approach. That's what we think that it could work. So to implement this co-regulation mechanisms, including the participation of young people, we need to consider that they are the biggest users of social media, the youth or people aged between 20 and 29 years old. And that the co-regulation might offer an alternative to self-regulation to tech companies, which we know is a voluntary process that doesn't provide the same guarantees as laws and regulatory solutions, and tend to establish codes of conduct that do not match the needs of society. When we look at this issue, and again, this is technology-facilitated gender-based violence, we really need to understand that this is a social and a human problem and threat that has been exacerbated by technology. So it is also, when we think about correlation, we also see it as an alternative to regulatory frameworks issued by governments and parliamentarians that miss the opportunity to address the business model of social media companies and put at risk the protection of human rights in digital space. So we are creating a vacuum sometimes in terms of transparency that is a perfect ground for disinformation and other forms of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, because we're seeing this, right? When we have an approach taken specifically by governments, well, as we're seeing in certain parts of Latin America, particularly in Central America, in Brazil, in Argentina, what we're seeing is a reduction of the freedom of speech, a reduction of freedom of media that is being in place to actually facilitate the work of governments and opening the door to dictatorships, or as we've seen in some countries where the regulatory framework is being used against the opposition, for example. So it's very important that we don't only work in self-regulation, because we know that somehow that self-regulation does not exist within social media companies, but that we complement the application of this measurement with a human rights approach to establish and protect equality, have a healthy public sphere, and ensure the public infrastructure is shaped and guided by democratic structures for an adequate governance on the use of technology. So there are multiple examples in the regions of how when there is no a more horizontal, when there isn't a horizontal approach, a holistic approach, we fall into bigger issues that we need to work on preventing.
Thank you, Paulina. What about you, Christina? What's your take on this very multi-layered issue? I mean, we're not expecting magical solutions today, but we're kind of expecting a loud roadmap, if I may say.
Exactly. And I think the Transform Initiative has such an important role to play. So here's my core advice, is that this is about building political will to rein in big tech. And so that sounds often odd. And I talk about this in lots of countries where they would think like, hey, are you kidding me? We're not going against trillion-dollar companies. Like, we got enough of problems. Like, we got 99 problems. You want me to add big tech as another one? And I say yes, because you cannot separate it. And so let's break it down into practical things that can be done. First is that every country has a regulator. Every country has a series of stakeholders who are, if they're not legally in charge of social media and in some way creating this duty of care standards, they can start to initiate that conversation. Now, some regulators are going to be part of the autocratic regime, and that's going to be hard to do. But those conversations should happen. If you look at what the Australia e-safety program did, they established, a regulatory agency committed to keeping citizens safe online. And so they are in charge of removing harmful content within 24 hours of receiving a formal notice. In Mexico, they passed a new law that punishes those, perpetrating digital violence against women. So there's many things that interested stakeholders can do if we're asking them to do it. One of the things I've noticed, especially with Facebook, and we talk a lot about Facebook and Meta, as we should, because they have the largest reach. So it's an ecosystem in the way that gender-based attacks get organized. So you can't blame one platform. And we overemphasize Twitter in most parts of the world because we used to have access to the API to research it. So that was a research tool that was better. Now that API access is being cut off by Musk. So this is a big problem. But if we look back at the role of Meta, here's what I would say. Quit inviting them 2 panel discussions that you are organizing in various countries, where they are essentially given a stage to gaslight the audience about what they are doing for women's safety. So that would be sort of one, let's stop doing that, because those individuals don't have power internally. And in fact, they drive the conversation away from accentuating our own power based on our knowledge of what's going on. So the Facebook Meta representative who covers all of East Africa, Mercy, is the same kind of profile of the former civil society woman, and they're all women largely. In Ukraine, Katya, who before the invasion was saying like, oh, we're doing all we can to deal with Russia propaganda, which wasn't true and has been proven to be absolutely false in the way that Facebook continues to perpetuate dehumanizing content in light of conflict. And then that was the same person, Flava, in Brazil, you know, who was going around meeting with embassies, meeting with international organizations and NGOs saying like, look at our women's safety approach. So let's be smarter about this in this next period. Let's not invite them unless there's an actual equal power and we have some guarantee that their promises are more than just empty promises. So we need leverage. So that would be the 2 points of leverage in this field in order to truly address gender-based violence and technology-facilitated violence against women, gender disinformation, the 2 levers, law, policy, strategic legislation. So the efforts, again, in Kenya, that they're dealing with liability of the platforms and their responsibility for conflict, war, ethnic hatred, and civil war, essentially, in Ethiopia is being challenged, as well as the labor practices of the content moderation process. So those cases are really important to not only pay attention to, but try to support, because it reveals the inadequacies of the system that is not protecting people, whether it's terrorist content, attacks against women, scams, and things that are frauding people on an everyday level. So that's an important bucket, and that looks different for each country. And legislation, of course, and policy isn't easy, which is why we should also look at the Digital Services Act, which is some part of a gold standard, because it does things to try to get leverage over the companies, and elements of that can in fact be replicated in other geographic areas, as Brazil just is issuing with a legislative package now, following up on the horrible way in which social media contributed to the situation in Brazil. So having, you know, this duty of care, talking about what individual countries can doing, and then being also prepared to challenge the nonsense, right? So in many conversations, we are shut down by the idea of like, oh my gosh, we can't do anything because doing something will infringe on free speech. And lo and behold, look at this person who's ready to already infringe on our free speech and already creating undemocratic systems in our country. How can we take that risk? But the harms are unfolding now in the status quo. We shouldn't be resolving for the potential of unintended consequences later when the status quo is causing damage. So how we have that conversation, how we work with civil society groups to make them more strategic, how we give them the language and the evidence. You know, freedom of speech doesn't guarantee freedom of reach. You know, we are dealing in the gendered attack machine with a lot of what is, you know, character attacks and the things that aren't illegal, but it's in the awful but lawful kind of category. And we should, in fact, organize around those things and put forward the people and the faces who are affected. And this is what Transform can do. You are part of building and growing and operating within the civil society structure, who in fact are storytellers, who can put messengers forward, who can contrast the lies of big tech with the reality of the women who are experiencing this. And I believe that is a very powerful tool that is in our hands. So mostly, let's not get dystopian about what we're dealing with here. It is absolutely a David and Goliath fight, but we have to find that strategic strike that will be impactful and have global solidarity when we do, which is why the global partnership launched to address gender-based violence and actions of that. I'll include a tweet here or a link here, is a really important mechanism to encourage other states and other countries to be part of. And there's a roadmap that is trying to address and legitimize the necessity to address this issue with also higher level stakeholders.
Thank you, Christina. I see that Paulina is nodding with her head. So Paulina, please, your point of view on this, but if we can, a bit
very
briefly
before,
because I want to jump into Irene and then ask all three of you our last question. So please go ahead, Paulina.
Yeah, but when I talk about co-regulation, again, like I said, I don't think as the panacea or anybody has an easy solution. It's just responding to the issue of the lack of participation in this conversation by social media platforms. Because as Christina said, when we encounter social media platforms representative and multiple panels here live, we hear the same speech over and over again, and there is no dialogue. And I just also wanted to mention that while I respect the view that many have about the Digital Service Act, I also don't think it's something that we should fully committed to look into. This is in a very specific situation that happened. The DSA actually took years of conversation for happening. It doesn't focus on the business model of the social media platforms, which is a huge effort. It's a huge problem, and it only starts apply from and I think about 15 months or so, which is in Q1 of 2024. So these two aspects leave a huge loophole that allows paid advertising by political organizations to freely disseminate false and misleading content against their counterpart. So it's a very real big problems. I agree fully that we need to focus on the lack of participation of social media platforms, but also understanding that each context, local context, is extremely relevant, and that whatever works in Europe might not work in Asia and in Latin America.
Thank you so much, Paulina. I want to move on to ask an open-ended question to all three of you, and I'll start by hearing out Irene, Paulina, and then Christina. Are there any examples that any of you can share of maybe some positive examples of strategies or legal strategies that some countries are using to address the issue of TFGBV? Are there steps that governments or civil societies are taking to prevent TFGBV, to protect diverse participation in democratic systems? I know that we discussed this. We mentioned what should be done. We mentioned some of the examples of abuse that are happening, but maybe other strategies that come to mind, or things that you would put on the table right now that you think are not being implemented. If any of this comes to mind, we would like to hear from you. So I'm going to start with you, Irene, knowing that policy is doing a lot of great work in Uganda. You're trying to strengthen tools that women politicians and their allies can have to address this violence that is happening and to continue to push their participation in political process in the country. So from your point of view, how do we answer this question? How do we answer this very vast question?
Our approach at policy, I had mentioned briefly, is we are trying to upskill the digital skills of women leaders. We are very specific on the word upskill because we recognize women politicians are very knowledgeable. They're already using digital platforms one way or another at a personal capacity or at the professional capacity or even at the national government capacity as a, as a government employee at the end of the day. So we upskill them in terms of trying to understand what their specific needs are. We work with them and we tell them, we are learning from you as much as you're learning from us. And in that way, we build sort of trusts, and they're able to collaborate with us, and they're also able to ask questions directly to some of the tech platforms who we really try and bring connections to. We have been privileged to work greatly with some of the big tech platforms, which is, I know, if you all know, a rarity. And we've been able to put them, as Christina was telling us, to really keep away from. We've been able to ask them and hold them to account and ask them, what are you doing for so-and-so? We've been able to invite women politicians to ask very specific questions about their experiences online, as basic as, why don't I ever have my blue tick, which many a times will help me when I report, or many a times will help me, will help my messages be amplified. So number one is building the trust and movement building. And number two, in terms of some of the strategies we are really trying to employ, is working with, multi-stakeholder approaches. Today in the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum being held in Nairobi by Paradigm Initiative, the key word that we are taking home is multi-stakeholderism. If you do not work with all sectors in the digital rights and Internet of Things space, you will find that the decisions being made that will harm others while also leaving out others, while also including others. So it's important to work together from the onset, especially many governments in Africa who are setting up their data governance structures based off of the different Africa Union data and digital rights frameworks. It's important to work together. So for donors who are funding some of these processes, for the Transform program at Pact, we know you're going to be quite useful in collaborating with local civitechs and newly formed feminist civitech societies and organizations in Africa who are even yet to be registered, but are doing remarkable work in really engendering the process on data governance and digital rights, as well as making sure that the voice of the woman is not being left out when we are contextualizing and localizing some of these frameworks. Thank you very much, Luna and Laurel.
Thank you, Irene. Paulina, and then Christina. And I just want to ask you to be mindful that we have very few minutes left. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, again, in the cases of the best example, again, I'm not 100% fan of the DSA, but I think as Christina also mentioned, it can help. There are certain things that we can learn. I think that in Latin America, there are a couple positive, good examples: the Inter-American Model Law on Prevention, Sanctioning, and Eradication of Political Harassment and Violence against Women in Political Life, which includes defamation, slander, insults, and other forms of gender-based political violence that denigrate women in the exercise. That can definitely help. It has an innovative focus. The law also recognizes as a form of violence, providing women with false, running, and impressive information. And in the case of Bolivia, the law to prevent and sanction violence and harassment against women in political life consider the acts of gender-based violence, the dissemination of false information related to women, public political functions, etc. And finally, the case of Peru, which is one of the latest, right before Mexico, where it speaks of a dissemination of images or messages through the media or social network that transmit and reproduce relations of inequality and discrimination, as well as disclosure of information. So these are great examples, all legal examples. But when we look at the context also, we need to figure it out and try to learn and understand whether or not they're going to work. I mean, there are other factors coming into place into these countries that actually can help perpetuate the issue and not resolve it. And it can definitely open the door for authoritarianism in this country. So in Peru, for example, they do have the first female president, but that doesn't mean that this law is going to work, and we need to wait definitely for the implementation of a much longer term of this bill, as well as other reforms in different countries to understand if rule of law actually is playing the role that it needs to play.
Thank you, Paulina. Christina?
Yeah, I would go to the second bucket of leverage. So I spoke about the first being law, policy, strategic litigation that is trying to get our hands around these trillion-dollar companies and try to leverage some control. The second thing, when you don't have those laws and policies, is the market pressure points. So this is an opportunity in each country, and there's different research that shows the way that advertising dollars are upholding, whether it's an Andrew Tate or an Andrew Kebe, which is the manosphere super spreader, coming out of East Africa. There's dollars behind, YouTube promotion of those. There's tools that YouTube is giving to the manosphere. There's ways in which then to localize that as not in this country, when we organize and develop communication strategies around those type of what we call market pressure points. So you can look at the way that employees of the companies are operating. There's been a whole set of whistleblowers. And it's not just out of the West. It was a South African whistleblower in Time magazine who came forward that is now the basis of 3 lawsuits on East Africa. So finding a way to support and look at the opportunities when they arise to communicate strategically. We also talk a lot in this field about the need for more research. We have the contours of the problem is well known and well documented in terms of the patterns of attack, the threat surface of attacks, the geographic both differences and similarities. Now we can drill deeper in each country and should, but that research strategy should match a communication strategy, a message strategy. I had put in the chat the link to the Rights at Risk report, which is amazing. I mean, you can see, thanks to the Pope in the phrasing of gender ideology, how that has been captured, especially by the West and entities like the Daily Wire and organizations that are trying to put an African face on this, but it actually include a lot of white people from the West who have been in a 20-year strategy to take an anti-transgender and anti-LGBT and anti-sexual reproductive health strategy forward. So we have to do more with the research than just gather it. We have to figure out how and what do we do that is localized in each country, but that can be organized to take in consideration of not just the bad actors, but the bad platforms that are part of accentuating this problem. And I guess that would be my last piece, is that we don't even have to get the platforms to implement new rules. Just get them to try to implement, implement their existing rules, because they say they have rules for all the things that we've been talking about. So localizing pressure campaigns and a demand structure to those platforms to show that they are not doing that and what the consequences and who the victims are gives us a point of power. We need to operate in this environment from a position of power, not victimization and weakness. And I think we can be successful in this next period if we organize strategically with that framework in mind.
Thank you so much, Christina. Paulina, Irene, and Christina, thank you so much for in my personal, very subjective opinion, for a very inspiring panel and opinions from all across the globe that I personally really enjoyed listening to. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. I am sad that we're coming to the end of this panel. We hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did.